Okay, so what I'm going to show with you is a kind of a variation of a lecture that I used to give when I taught at the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. I used to run the Fresco program. I ran it from 2008 to 2019 when I passed it off to Oscar Rene Cornejo. And it's without, I feel it'd be important to describe this place quickly before we move into the frescoes themselves. And so, and fresco, as many of you know, it's painting into wet plaster. And this plaster, it's a very specific kind of plaster, which I'll get into later. When it dries, it retains this paint. So there's no binder with the paint at all. And so when it dries, it crystallizes, and then the painting physically becomes a part of the wall. So what you're going to see are images that are examples of different kinds of frescoes and different sort of themes and different sites in which fresco is installed. But part of what I'm motivated by with fresco, and you can see by the paintings in the exhibition, is that you have a medium that's really old and suddenly now it's portable. And so I'm really curious about like how that reflects contemporary life, like this idea of change, sudden change. Yeah, and part of that is due to the inclusion of technology or the new technologies that make it possible. So Skowhegan, the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture is an artist residency in school that runs every summer. It didn't run this summer because of the COVID, and it's a 9-week residency where artists live together for the entire time. 65 emerging artists live together, and they have studios next to each other. They eat. They collaborate. There are parties. They live a full life. They're basically leaving their lives and becoming a part of a new community for 9 weeks. So the school is founded by WPA artists, and many of those artists have a kind of have experience working with fresco. And so when it was founded, fresco was included as a part of the school, part of the curriculum there, as well, in one way, it was a way to give them young artists skills so that they can make money while they're working in the studio. But it was also a way for them to learn an old process. The school has evolved a bit, but fresco remains a part of the curriculum as an opportunity to participate in the history, but also try a technique that is really difficult to access. And with that difficulty comes these kind of potential situations where you have to adjust. And really much that's the arc of Skowhegan. It's like, how do you adjust to this environment? And how do you adjust to these, like being out in the woods and having to deal with nature, but also how do you deal with having to cohabitate with 64 people, and then there's staff and faculty. How do you adjust your lives together? So, and in this class, it wasn't just for painters. I mean, the school was, it admits people that do video, that do dance, that that make ceramics. They're sculptors and painters work in, a variety, a wide spectrum of mediums. And so when I taught in the program, I really tried to promote a kind of, an openness that anyone could take something away from it. Anyone can learn something from it, but it's also a great leveler where everyone had to adjust to it. And so, in fact, the painters could actually be some of the hardest people to recruit for the class. There's a kind of pitch I give, which is what I'm sharing with you, where I try to get them to think, oh, this is a really old process. Why would I want to make frescoes when I'm doing something completely different? So the painters can be hard to get in there because many of them have a very rigid process they're very comfortable with, and to get outside of that comfort zone can be really difficult. So with that, I'm going to share with you some images of frescoes that I find to be really interesting and So this is the Queen of Sheba, is the Ethiopian fresco from the 12th to 13th century in Ethiopia. This is a Nubian bishop at Aksum in Ethiopia. It's a Geralta Peaks, Tigray, Ethiopia. Bear in mind, please bear with me. I don't know how to fully pronounce these, a lot of these places, so I apologize for anything I've mispronounced. In addition to that, many of these photos I've taken from the internet. I don't claim as my own. I'm just sharing. This is another Ethiopian fresco. This is from the Deborah Baran Selassie Church in Gondar of Ethiopia. This is 17th century. These are Korean frescoes in the Goguryeo tomb, going back to 336 CE. In the 1840s, these are Indian frescoes, the Sonchandi Dedukan in the village of Mahanasar. The Haveli of the Skowhegan region of northeastern Rajasthan includes, so this is 19th century. This is the Sigira frescoes in Sri Lanka from 480 CE. These Iranian frescoes, the Chihil Sutun, 1647 from Isfahan. These are Syrian frescoes, Saint Eileen, 6th century. Chinese frescoes from Dunhang Mogabo Caves, 366. Tibetan fresco in the Diskit Monastery in the 1500s. More Tibetan fresco of the Potala Palace, Lhasa Tibet, in the Qing dynasty. Mayan frescoes, Bonampak in the 8th and 9th century. The Cachlata in Mexico Mayan murals, 7th or 8th century. And here's Masaccio's Trinity, Santa Maria Novella, 1428. So along with these many cultures and making fresco at different times, and these frescoes, they all vary in their own way. The Italians, their method is called the buon fresco, the true fresco method, but there's really just many ways to make fresco. So along with this, fresco, I think when I think of fresco, I think of also the many subjects that have been portrayed. So these are, this is a theme of betrayal by Giotto, the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua. So moments of tenderness and love. These are the Greek frescoes of the Tomb of the Diver in Paestum in southern Italy, 470 BCE. Images of war, the Iranian fresco, the Battle of Chalidran, 1646. Portrayals of race and racism in culture. Right? This is Anne Rice O'Hanlon. The wall of Memorial Hall in the University of Kentucky, made in 1934 for the Treasury Relief Art Project. There are also images of revolution. This is Diego Rivera's Indian warrior at Smith College, 1931. Image of industry and technology. This is Diego Rivera, the Detroit Institute of Art, 1932 to 33. These are images of play, the Actori frescoes in the Greek island of Santorini. And of course, images that are spiritual and religious, the Annunciation of San Marco, Fra Angelico, 1450. Of course, we can't talk about fresco without recognizing architecture. This is a Bisserico Airborne in Romagna, 1502. The Chapelle Saint-Michel and Saint-Julien in Brioude, France. This is the view from the southeast. The Chapelle Saint-Michel. This was made in the 10th or 11th century. There's Teotihuacan, right? Like it's architecture, and with that, like often associated with sites of power. The details of the mountain stream mural from the Teplanta compound, which appears under the great goddess made from the 2nd to 5th centuries CE, Common Era. The great goddess of Teotihuacan. And here's the Vatican, in a grotesque of the 15th century. This is 30 Rockefeller Plaza. In there was a famous fresco that was destroyed by Diego Rivera. He was working on a cartoon up for that. This is Man of the Crossroads in 1933, so it was destroyed after the image, controversial inclusion of Vladimir Lenin, and between Rockefeller and Diego Rivera, they did not agree on his inclusion. So it was later built in Mexico City, 1934. This is a little room underneath the Medici Chapel in Florence, where Michelangelo hid from the Pope while Pope Clement in 1530. So this is kind of like a mezzo fresco working into wet plaster, and it slowly calcifies over it. The air quality actually retained the drawings. It was not, people were not sure whether or not these were truly Michelangelo's until they were certified by scholars. I believe it was in the 90s. So he was in there for 3 months making these drawings. This is Lorenzo Casamante, who I worked with in Florence and learned about this and learned some fresco techniques. This is just a generic, actually I shouldn't say generic, there's an image of Walmart, I have no idea where it is, but it's a pretty common sort of like recognizable sort of feature of Walmart. And this is Daniel Boshkoff, who's a person I worked with at Skowhegan, who previously ran the shop there. This is a fresco called Training in Assertive Hospitality, where he became a greeter at Walmart. And when he was there, he convinced the manager to install a fresco mural in the layaway department. And so, again, thinking of sites of power, right? So eventually, you know, it's a fascinating project. I recommend looking into his work, highly recommended, in fact. But here this is the only Walmart where they have unique art in the country, in the world, as far as I know. Eventually it was taken down because they had to remodel the Walmart. And so it was no longer a unique Walmart in that way. But when I think of fresco, really the initial connection I had with fresco is that it was so old and had so many subjects and so many sites and so many cultures that had touched upon it and worked with it. I think about it, how it's charged with history. And because of this, I think of it as a kind of metamaterial that when you're working with fresco, there's inherent meaning, just laying plaster onto a surface and paint with it. So the buon fresco process, it's really important to know or understand what the fresco cycle is. There's a fresco cycle that we can associate with the Scrovini Chapel, with Giotto, where you have a kind of story, like a proto sort of sequential art, and then you have this other cycle, which is a chemical cycle. And so it all begins with the rock, becomes heated. Carbon dioxide is released from it. Then that is what is left as quicklime. The quicklime is then hydrated, becomes slaked lime. That's a lime putty, and the lime putty is aged to make it more stable. And then when it's applied to a wall, it pulls back in carbon dioxide. And so what it's doing is returning to its rock form. So it starts as a rock and it ends as a rock. So essentially, when you look at a fresco, you're looking at a really refined rock. And the painting becomes a part of it because that crystal, the calcium carbonate crystal that begins as a limestone and finishes as the stone, forms over the paint. And so there's essentially rock above the paint and below the paint. So that's physically a part of the wall. It's very different than other murals because and what, again, what often makes it, what really makes it unique is this lack of need for a binder. Some cultures do use a binder. And to be honest, you know, I'm not exactly sure how that works for them. Like the Sri Lankan fresco, there's some animal fat involved in there. So I'm not exactly sure how that works, but I know it is possible. But in a sense of like how many people in Western culture understand fresco, just going pure paint, pure pigment, paint into the wall, delivered with water. So is really what fresco is. So begins with the limestone. The limestone is presented from, is pulled from a quarry. This is one in Norway, okay? And the limestone needs to have a certain sort of calcium carbonate purity, or is ideal. As I understand it, 95% is good. And then within the last 5%, there's some other things like magnesium that makes it stronger. To be honest, I don't exactly know why, but that's what I've read. Here's Carrara, Italy. And then it's mined and then put into a big stove, a big oven. And so this is like a traditional sort of lime kiln. So, and when it's heated at a really high temperature, about 1800 degrees Fahrenheit or 1000 degrees Celsius for 24 hours. So that's removing the carbon dioxide. Okay, and you're left with these kind of ghosts. So these are more kilns. You can make a kind of paint with also as a kind of binder, which is what lime wash is. But this is, in the interest of fresco, it's important to not integrate anything unless it's very specific to the task that you're performing. So I work with sgraffito, so I also integrate some pigment into the plaster. But for the most part, you just put in sand or marble dust. Sometimes you put horsehair, things to reinforce it to give it a kind of structure. Here's a very romantic image of Turner in a lime kiln. So these rocks become a kind of ghosts. They're more fragile, and it's calcium oxide. And industrially it gets produced like this and then refined, okay? And so in this state, it's quite inert. But when you hydrate it, it becomes extremely toxic, really, and caustic, to the point that like it could really burn you really bad. So, and that's the exothermic kind of character of it, is that when you first hydrate it, there's a kind of volatile reaction between the water and the calcium oxide. And so what you're ending up with is calcium hydroxide. So when you're slaking lime, it should be done wearing full gear to cover your skin from head to toe. These materials are used for many kinds of things, not just for fresco or for painting, but it's great for breaking down organic material. It's good for also neutralizing soil because so sometimes you'll see calcium oxide sprinkled on the ground, or actually lime dust. And underneath pine trees, because it's a very basic compound, it will neutralize the soil. So here are layers. So because when you're building up your fresco, you need to build it up in layers. You can't, it's not like plaster is a very ambiguous term. I call it plaster, but it's not like plaster of Paris where you can cast with it, or it's very difficult to cast with, because it needs to draw in carbon dioxide. And so what you do is you work with thin layers. So here's a profile of a fresco I did. And so what you can see here in this illustration is that there's 3 layers that I have going on. I have an initial scratch coat, which is the blue coat here. And then you have a riccio, which is like a middle coat, and then intonaco, which is the top coat. Every coat has different sort of proportions of sand or aggregate that, again, works as a kind of binder and structure. And as you move towards the painting layer, you go with finer sand and a higher proportion of lime to sand. You can go with high proportion sand and lime back here, but you're wasting your money. The lime is the most expensive part. So you wanna make sure it's structurally sound first, and then you create this really yummy surface that is easy to move around and paint with, or paint on top of. There are a few things you can integrate, like brick dust, horsehair, or other sort of materials to give it more painting time or a different kind of structure. But for the most part, you work with washed sand that's not from the ocean, that it's from rivers, or it's been refined from a place that doesn't have stagnant water. So you don't want any sort of organic materials in your fresco. To build a fresco, you have a limited amount of time to make a fresco. So if you have a big wall, it's really difficult to execute a large wall without it drying. So when you're involved with the fresco cycle, you're really participating in a very small portion of it, where when it's drying, after the wall is assembled, you're fighting that window. So once it's on the wall, depending on a number of things, like how thick your wall is, how humid the atmosphere is, how much you hydrated the layers prior to. You may have a couple hours, you may have 12 hours. It varies. But to execute a large wall, when you're painting into it, you're actually delivering water to it and you're hydrating it. So the more you work around the painting, the better. But when you're working on a really large fresco, it's just so hard to get everything in. So the Italians have this technique called the giornatas, which means a day of work or just a day. And so you can see here is a Giotto painting where the giornata lines are. And so the idea is that you lay up the plaster right up to the edge of a previous day's worth of painting. And when you go to, if you go to Italy or any place that uses these techniques, it's fun to actually get up to the wall and you can see not only the hand that had with the brush, but you can also see the hand of the plasterer where they had actually integrated that seam. And so we'll go back a little bit here. For the most part, like you don't want lines in the middle of a field of color. You want it around a composition. You want it to follow an architectural feature. So it's a little easier for you to manage how to integrate those seams. So pigments, every pigment has different characteristics. So this is a pigment wall that I would work with in Skowhegan. We had a lot available. They all have different sort of saturations and etc. So some of them would fade over time with the fresco. They need to be processed with water. This is a colleague of mine, Nadia Ayari, who's a really fantastic fresco painter as well, working in the shop. So the painting, as I mentioned, is the part at the very end of the fresco cycle, right here. So all this time and labor goes into delivering this moment here. And it's part of what I love about fresco is that we're dealing with an ancient material, goes through a processing, and then it's aged. Traditionally you want to have your lime aged for 2 years. It's a little less important now because things are industrially produced, but still it really does have more of a plastic and supple sort of characteristic when you work with aged lime. So you let it age for a while, and then there's all this labor in actually building the walls. And then you have this window here of 2 to 12 hours, right? It's where it's suddenly the hourglass flips. So I think about this. I'm really fascinated with this kind of these two kind of like these two labors, these two kind of scopes, if like that run like one against the other, but one is faster and one's slower. And that in that moment, you're painting, you're working, and you have to find a kind of relationship with the surface. because even within this small window here, which I'm just kind of imagining through this kind of looping arrow, the wall is drying. So when you first work with the wall, it's shy. It will resist the paint. So you have to pace yourself. But as it pulls in carbon dioxide, as it starts to calcify, you're able to actually pick up the paste. And if you don't, if you approach your painting like you're printing out something, you go from top to bottom or right to left, or if you work in one area for too long, another part of it is drying. So it's important that you work all around the surface. So there's this really interesting dynamic where the surface is really commanding. And so this is part of the reason why working with painters or I should say not working with the painters, it can be difficult for painters to work with this, is that they have to get outside of that comfort zone, something they're very familiar with, and actually bend to the character of the material. And this is what I come at as a sculptor, is thinking about the character of the materials. I'm really fascinated with that, like how those, like what is one character of the material different at one moment versus another moment. Anyhow, so it's for this reason, like I think about fresco. This is a rare moment where the romantic idea of the artist and the surface, right, the painter alone in the studio, and the chemical reality of it drying and calcifying, really they come together, become one. And that for me is like a really magical kind of like a sort of experience to understand like how that wall transforms because of the way you're touching it, the way that you're moving paint around on it, how you offer tenderness at one point, and other points you can be more aggressive. I think that's really, really fascinating. So some personal background. So these are some old frescoes that I have. When I came to Skowhegan, I came as a sculptor, worked with just found materials. And I thought a lot about the history of materials. Not just the history of their development, but also the history of the lives that people had lived with them. And so when I was at Skowhegan, I didn't really actually want to do fresco because I just thought I was like a lot of the artists who thought, oh, I'm not a painter. I'm not really interested in those kind of conversations. But I had some struggles. I had some problems, and I figured over the course of the summer, because of a number of reasons involving, I hurt my hand, or one of my hands, had expected to do a lot of work outside, and it rained a lot, so it would have ruined anything I'd done. So I decided, hey, I'll give it a shot. Why not try it? And I really immediately connected to it because the labor felt really familiar, because I understand how to make walls, at least drywall. But this history, as I just went through, like, is something I think is really meaningful, and that it working as a metamaterial, really, I felt like as a sculptor, there's a kind of conversation about materials that you work with, defining what the object is. Well, I didn't really feel any drawn to anything like any sort of other materials like bronze casting or woodworking or anything. I knew how to do some of those things, and I integrated into my practice, but I didn't let those materials speak for themselves. But in this case, I felt like I could trust fresco. So I made a lot of works that were freestanding, because I don't have a home that I could build these in, and I was a student at the time, and it just made sense to make things portable. So I was working with found objects, and creating a kind of platform, like thinking fresco as a platform for them. That these objects I thought of as mortal objects, right? A wheelchair, a gun rack. I felt like there's a connection between those things. I also made work where I was interested in human sort of characteristics, like like being inventive doesn't really belong to one culture or one person. It's a kind of characteristic that we all have the potential to share. So this is a Foxhole radio. This is a radio made out of found material soldiers would make when they're either in the field fighting or they were POWs. And these were really amazing objects that were really inventive, that used everyday parts to create something like a crystal radio. So I created a kind of a tribute to that. They would use the bayonet, the US soldiers would use a bayonet as a ground to take the static out of what they were listening to. This is an early version of the dialysis machine. I made a kind of like a Fresco dialysis machine. This is a pirate radio station I made that played only Led Zeppelin, kind of like a teenage dream of mine that I realized through this. And with that, the broadcast antenna, which is a little difficult to see in here, it's a wire reproduction of an El Greco painting. El Greco, you know, very much has a kind of sort of heaven and earth kind of defined. I thought that worked very well with this idea of radio. This is a, I don't have this in my notes for some reason. These are sound mirrors found on the coast of England. These are really these are early versions of, or precursors to radar, where people were listening to sound through these parabolic listening devices. So I created a fresco on the left here that would reflect sound. And from this other sculpture, a whistled version of a Black Sabbath song would be, which is a heavy metal band from the 60s, would play and hit this surface. And because the nature of fresco, it's hard, it's very good for reflecting sound. So I managed to get access to a robot that carved the surface and created this parabolic feature on all this found foam. And so, as I said before, you know, fresco is an ancient process, essentially unchanged, 3,500 years. And then along comes the 20th century, and here's foam. You can carve it, put fresco on it, you can float it, it's portable. New possibilities are available for it. And like, what does that mean? Like that something so old can be new again. And so here's an image of me standing at the focal point. This is the back of it. So the front was carved by a robot, and the back was hand hewn with a saw. These are disembodies, similar kind of aesthetic. It's something that like comes and goes, where I just stack up found foam. Playing with neon colors and traditional sort of ground. So there's, here you see the ochre on the inside of it, and then the super heavy saturated fluorescent. You see a little bit of that going on with the leftovers. And so these leftovers were really quick studies. Burlap can work as a support for it, for fresco, if you approach it in a certain way with respect to material. And I back it with aluminum so it doesn't crack, but once you have it backed, it works very well. So the fresco material itself is really indifferent to where it goes. It just wants to perform in the way that it chemically can. It pulls in carbon dioxide and calcifies. So I made a lot of these paintings during my workshops out of leftover pigments that were there. So there's a little bit of a pun there, right? Thinking of leftovers and food, but also I take a tool and I extract part of the painting. So I make the full painting and then I recompose it by pulling away the parts. And so I'm fascinated with abstractions. This is like, I come back to abstraction sometimes. I'm working a little more representationally right now, but still I think of abstraction in respect to the distance it creates from our shared reality. Think about its potential as a way to organize and distill information, but paradoxically, it can make things opaque. It can also, we lose nuance and make things inaccessible. So, so I made these frescoes not too long ago, well, at least in 2018 and 2016. And I hang them without a frame because I want people to feel, I want that fragility to be activated, that it feels light and very contrary to the kind of monumental sort of association that we have with fresco. This is how I displayed it with these foam kind of like sort of juicy, chunky foam sculptures that feel very bodily. I like exhibiting them together because I like that kind of tension or the kind of energy that you get between these two. I'm going to skip over this piece, but this is a part of the same exhibition. This is just another kind of abstraction, but that was part of the exhibition is just found footage on YouTube of people at sporting events getting in fights and just thinking of that as another kind of abstraction. So when I think of these works together, like the foams, the frescoes, the video, they really reflect a kind of relationship to chemistry, to time, to volatility. So I like how they perform together as a kind of constellation of rawness, grotesqueness, aggression, and seduction. And you can see, do you see in this, do you see an ancient resilient process? Like, do you see a fragile fragment of calcium carbonate? Is it flesh? Is it plastic? Like, what do you see in these things? Is this person someone to fight, or is it someone to celebrate with or cheer with? And so in my work, I really think a lot about violence. Like it's shaped my life, shaped everyone's life in many ways. And so, so I'm presenting these questions in a sort of binary opposition, but I really think of them as resonating together. It's not one or the other. It's not, is it violent? Or is it soft? You know, it's like both of these things are possible. And so fresco is both fragile and stoic. I think of foam as really saccharine and sweet, or toxic. And I think about people at sporting events can be happy and aggressive and violent at the same time. So this is the new work that I'm doing, and I'll finish up. So thank you for your patience. So I have new work where I'm kind of combining two things that have a kind of formal alignment, but also are very much unaligned. So this is an image from the cover of a band called Dark Throne. This is referring to black metal, which is a really dark kind of music. It's really aggressive. It's very extreme. It's really misanthropic. Like they really sing about some really bad things. I actually enjoy the music, you know, but I feel like there's a lot of problems with what they say. And often they lean to a kind of fascist end, like they really believe in that kind of ideology. And so this is my cat. She's my muse. And so when I adopted her a couple years ago, I was really struck by the likeness that they share between their markings, like this really hyper violent and aggressive sort of caricature that you would see in black metal. They wear this makeup called corpse paint, so to look spooky or scary. My cat, she kind of has a grumpy look, but she's the sweetest thing. So yeah, she's totally my muse. And so these are the works that are starting to come out, where I'm working with found salvaged foam. Sometimes it's sculpted foam, where I'm just putting them together, these characters together. This is called Bros. This is called The Institutionalist. This is called Cold Hand. It's a kind of a cult, KVLT is a term in black metal to really just describe what is pure and authentic in black metal. This is Moonlight Procession. This is Soft and Tough. So this is where the work is going. So I'm pretty excited by it. But that is the fresco process, and a little bit about little access to what's driving or motivating these works.
When you do your fresco, do you have to go through that process every time you make the plaster, I'll call it, but the base, or do you have that ready made for you?
That's a really good question. So I don't make the lime because that involves resources that
Yeah, you got to dig it
I
out.
just don't have access to. I mean, I could do it, but, and I've talked with people who have actually made their own lime by collecting seashells and firing them and then hydrating it.
Right.
But I get the lime, but I make the plaster itself with the sand proportions. And what's different again, different from plaster of Paris is that because it only cures when it's exposed to the air. As long as you don't let it freeze, you can keep it in a sealed bucket and it'll last years and years and years. So, so I pre-mix stuff in advance, but I milk it for as long as I need to.
Do you do by color? You save
Sometimes, yeah. So the black, the new paintings, those are sgraffitos. So you're actually seeing a black ground with a lime wash over it, and I scratch out the dark sort of intonaco underneath. So yeah, you do that sometimes. In this case, I like that.
One more question, if I may.
Sure.
Venetian plaster. Have you ever heard of that?
Oh yeah, yeah.
For decorating walls and such, and is what you do similar in any way? And that's my last question.
Yeah. So there's a few kinds of Venetian plaster out there. There's ones with some synthetic binders in it, but the traditional one involves like a kind of animal glue with it. I have worked with it. I don't include it in my process. It is a really, really, really sexy material to work with. I gotta say, those walls are really amazing when you see them and touch them and just marvel at like the kind of the way they build those walls. But no, I don't include it, though I would be interested in doing it.
I tried it once, but the color seemed to be fugitive. It faded. Yeah. From where the sun hit it, which I wasn't expecting. So I have a very strange looking wall now.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
That's all right. It's another problem to solve.
I don't know if you've, I don't know where you get your pigments from, but Kramer Pigments, which I don't know how they work with, Kramer with a K. I don't know how they work with Venetian plaster, but I bet the people that work there are incredible experts. Like they have.
I use a paint can. You bought it at the paint store. That's all I use.
Oh, okay. So you go to them. Their catalog will tell you what will last and what will not last.
Good. Thanks for the tip.
Yeah.
I have a question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I've been working with a fresco type of technique. I've been calling it fresco. So my question to you is, and I work abstractly, but I put a joint compound on, substrate, whatever, many different kinds. And I've been terming it a fresco acrylic when I'm entering shows or whatever. Is that kind of a false definition of what I'm doing? Because I love the fact that I can build it up and I can scratch into it and I can texturize it and blah, blah, blah. So, but am I falsely identifying what I'm doing?
Well, yeah, I don't think that's technically fresco, but I don't know. I think it's great. I mean, you can, I don't know what that would be termed, because you're using acrylic on wet plaster. Or
well, you could use oil as well. I know someone that does that. I do a lot of different mixed media type of. I do graphite, so it wouldn't be strictly acrylic, but the base is this. It feels and looks like fresco to me because it's got that hard plaster-like surface. So I've been naming it that, but as I'm listening to it, I'm thinking maybe I'm really falsely identifying what I'm doing, and I don't want to do that, misrepresent.
Well, I think the important part of fresco, I think, is that it's physically, part of the wall. So if it's not calcifying over it, maybe you're bending the truth some. Why don't you call it mezzo fresco instead, which is like somewhere in between. It's like you're working with, or you can do, there's like a secondo kind of technique where the masters go back over with egg tempera. The reason I was a little shy, because first of all, I'm not a purist. I mean, we can talk about like the character of the materials and say, well, it's going to perform in the way it does. Doesn't matter what we think or we feel, it's going to do its thing. But when I was in the shop, I made a point of saying yes to as much as I could. Like, and to my students, I say that as well in undergrad. Like, I only have 2 rules: like, don't get arrested and don't hurt anyone. So, you know, so I mean, go for it. Go for all of that. If you were to work on foam, I do recommend you find some kind of acrylic base that allows you to make that next kind of a bond to it, and that
makes sense.
That's the big advancement. In addition to the foam, is that there's this material that is really designed for applying stucco to foam, which works with anything that is lime based or plaster based.